Her baby was crying from hunger in the grass. The rancher lifted them both into his arms. The prairie was silent until a single cry shattered the evening air. A rancher rode home at dusk, only to find a starving mother collapsed in the tall grass, her infant clutched tight, wailing with hunger. With no time to spare, he swept them into his arms and carried them toward the faint glow of his lamplit home. But sheltering a desperate widow and her child would set fire to every whisper in town. Prejudice, betrayal, and the ruthless railroad stand ready to crush them both. And as shadows close in, the rancher must decide, will he risk everything, land, freedom, even his life, to protect the weakest left in his care? The cry that began in the grass will echo across courtroom walls, church pews, and the heart of a man who swore never to love again. What happens when mercy collides with power and a starving child becomes the only voice strong enough to change? A hardened world? This channel isn't just about stories. It's about remembering what still holds value: empathy, truth, and the courage to care. The setting sun painted long shadows across the prairie as Robert Turner guided his horse along the fence line. His daily ritual of checking for breaks and loose posts was nearly done. The evening air carried the sweet scent of prairie grass, and meadowlarks called their last songs before nightfall. After 2 years alone on his ranch, Robert had grown used to the quiet, though the emptiness still gnawed at him. Sometimes his horse's hooves made soft thuds against the earth. When a different sound caught his attention, Robert pulled back on the reins, tilting his head to listen. There it was again, a baby's cry, thin and weak, carried on the evening breeze. He frowned, scanning the tall grass that swayed in the dying light. "Whoa there," he murmured to his horse, turning toward the sound. The crying grew clearer as he approached, and then he saw them, a woman lying crumpled in the grass, her arms wrapped protectively around a small bundle. The infant's cries had grown feeble, barely more than whimpers now. Robert swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He approached carefully, not wanting to frighten them. The woman's dark hair was tangled with grass, her dress dusty and worn. When she looked up at him, her eyes were glazed with exhaustion. "Please," she whispered, her voice rough from thirst. "My baby." Robert knelt beside them, his heart heavy at their condition. "Ma'am, I'm Robert Turner. Let me help you." "Susan," she managed. "Susan Ortega. We haven't eaten in days." Her arms trembled as she held her crying child. The setting sun cast long shadows across their faces, and Robert knew there wasn't time to waste. "I'm going to lift you both up now, Mrs. Ortega. My ranch house isn't far." She nodded weakly too, exhausted to protest. Robert gathered them carefully in his arms, surprised at how light they were. The baby quieted somewhat at the movement, making only soft whimpering sounds against its mother's chest. Getting them onto his horse took some maneuvering. Robert positioned Susan sideways across the saddle, making sure she had a secure hold on her infant before mounting behind her. He could feel her trembling against him as he reached around to grasp the reins. "Hold on now," he said softly. "We'll take it slow and steady." The prairie had grown darker, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky. Robert guided his horse carefully through the tall grass, mindful of his precious burden. Susan seemed to drift in and out of awareness, but her arms remained locked around her baby. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on Robert's shoulders. He hadn't expected to find anyone out here, much less a mother and child in such desperate need. Yet something in him had shifted the moment he'd lifted them into his arms, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since losing his wife Dot as they rode. The baby's cries grew softer, possibly soothed by the gentle motion of the horse. Robert could make out his ranch house now, a dark shape against the darkening sky. The small yellow square of his kitchen window glowed like a beacon, the lamp he always left burning casting its warm light into the gathering dusk. The creak of saddle leather, and the quiet nickering of his horse were the only sounds as they approached. The house. Susan stirred slightly, perhaps sensing they had arrived. "Almost there," Robert assured her, though he wasn't certain she heard him. The lamplight spilled out across the yard as they drew closer, promising warmth and shelter after the frightening discovery in the field. Robert's mind was already racing ahead. They would need food, water, a place to rest. The spare room hadn't been used in years, not since his wife. He pushed the thought aside. There would be time for memories later. Right now, these two souls needed help, and Robert Turner had never been one to turn away from duty when it presented itself. The lamp in his kitchen window flickered, as if beckoning them home, and for the first time in a long while, his ranch house didn't feel quite so empty. As they reached the yard, Robert drew his horse to a gentle stop. The full weight of what lay ahead settled over him, not just the immediate care these two needed, but all the questions and complications that would surely follow. Yet looking down at Susan and her child, he knew with certainty that he'd made the right choice. Sometimes, he reckoned, duty and conscience pointed a man down the same path. Robert fumbled with matches in the dim kitchen, his hands unusually clumsy as he lit the second oil lamp. The flame caught, casting a warmer glow across the weathered table where Susan Ortega sat cradling her fussing infant. Her eyes were half closed with exhaustion, but her grip on the baby remained firm. The familiar creak of floorboards under his boots echoed in the quiet kitchen as Robert moved to the stove. He hadn't warmed milk for anyone since Sarah passed, but his hands remembered the motions. The pot heated slowly while he cut thick slices from a loaf of coarse bread, the knife scraping against the cutting board. "Ma'am," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "The milk's nearly ready for the little one." Susan lifted her head, blinking in the lamplight. Her face was drawn with hunger and worry, but there was a quiet dignity in how she held herself. Robert poured the warm milk into a tin cup, testing its temperature on his wrist like Sarah had taught him to do with their neighbor's children years ago. "Much obliged," Susan whispered, accepting the cup with trembling hands. The baby's cries grew more insistent until she managed to help him drink. Little by little, the milk disappeared, and the child's desperate wails softened to whimpers, then to quiet suckling sounds. Robert stood awkwardly for a moment, then forced himself to action. Sarah would have known exactly what to do, would have had these folks comfortable in no time. The least he could do was try. He stirred the pot of broth he'd set to warming, the savory smell filling the kitchen. "There's a chair by the hearth," he sighed, gesturing to the sitting room just off the kitchen. "Might be more comfortable there, ma'am." Susan nodded, rising carefully with her now quieter bundle. Robert watched her unsteady steps, ready to help if needed, but she made it to the cushioned chair on her own. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her features. He brought her a bowl of broth and more bread, setting them on the small table beside her. "If you don't mind my asking," he said, settling into the other chair, "what brought you out to these parts?" Susan adjusted her hold on the baby, who had finally fallen asleep against her chest. "My husband," she began, her voice soft but clear. "He took work with the railroad crews. Said it would give us a fresh start." She paused, taking a careful sip of broth. "There was an accident. After that, I had nothing but Mateo here and a deed to some land we'd bought." The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Robert glanced toward the window, remembering how he'd found them in the grass. If he hadn't been checking that section of fence today. "Mateo," he repeated quietly, looking at the sleeping infant. His own evening had transformed so quickly, from the solitary routine he'd grown used to this kitchen filled with the presence of a mother and child who'd nearly been lost to the prairie. The shutters rattled again, harder this time, making Susan flinch. Robert rose and checked that they were properly latched. The sound of the wind only emphasized how vulnerable they'd been out there, with nothing but grass and sky for protection. "You're safe here," he said, more gruffly than he'd intended. "The spare room's just down the hall. Let me get it ready for you." The spare room hadn't been used since Sarah's passing. Robert lit another lamp and quickly stripped the dusty coverlet from the bed, replacing it with clean blankets from the chest. His movements were mechanical, but his mind was churning. Sarah would have known how to make this room welcoming. She'd always had a way of making folks feel at home. He set up the old cot near the bed, thinking it might serve as a makeshift crib for the baby. When he returned to the sitting room, he found Susan had finished the broth. Mateo was still sleeping. Soundly, his small fist curled against his mother's dress. "The room's ready," Robert said. "It ain't much, but it's warm." "Thank you, Mr. Turner," Susan replied, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need to dwell on that," he interrupted gently. "You just get some rest now." He showed them to the room, made sure they had everything they needed, then retired to his own bedroom down the hall. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his house with other people in it, the soft creak of floorboards, the occasional whimper from Mateo, the whispered comfort of his mother's voice. Through the thin walls, he could hear the baby's steady breathing, a reminder of how close they'd come to tragedy. Robert turned on his side, knowing he wouldn't sleep deeply tonight, keeping an ear tuned to any sound of distress from his unexpected guests. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Robert pulled on his worn boots. The familiar morning routine beckoned, guests or no guests. The floorboards creaked softly under his feet as he made his way to the kitchen, careful not to wake his sleeping visitors. Outside, the air held that peculiar stillness that belonged only to early morning. Robert's breath made little clouds in the cool air as he headed for the barn. The cow needed milking, and the chickens wouldn't wait for anyone's convenience. He was just finishing with the morning milking when he heard movement from the house. Susan stood in the doorway, Mateo bundled against her chest, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," she said softly. "Please, let me help with something." Robert straightened up from the milk pail, noting how she swayed slightly on her feet. "Ma'am, you're still weak." "No need to, please," she interrupted, her voice firmer despite its quietness. "I need to do something useful." Robert considered for a moment, then nodded. "Reckon you could help gather eggs if you're feeling up to it. It's gentle work." He showed her to the chicken coop, demonstrating how to reach carefully under the hens, while keeping Mateo secured with one arm. The baby watched with wide eyes as his mother collected her first egg, making a small sound of delight that brought an unexpected smile to Robert's face. Back in the kitchen, Robert stirred up a pot of porridge while Susan arranged the eggs in a bowl, Mateo cooing softly in her lap. The morning light streamed through the window, catching dust motes in its beam. "My husband," Susan began suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He worked so hard for us." She paused, adjusting Mateo's blanket. "The railroad promised good wages, $3 a day for laying track. But the work," she swallowed hard, "the work was dangerous." Robert set 2 bowls of porridge on the table, waiting quietly as she gathered her thoughts. "There was an accident. A rail fell. Miguel," her voice cracked slightly. "He didn't come home that evening." She reached into her dress pocket with trembling fingers, producing a folded paper, worn at the creases but still intact. "This is all we have left, the land he bought with his first wages. He was so proud, saying the spring there would give us a good life." Robert took the deed carefully, studying the legal writing. His heart sank as he recognized the location. That spring was one of the few reliable water sources in the area, exactly the kind of resource the railroad would want to control. "May I?" he asked, holding the deed up to the morning light. The document appeared genuine, the signatures clear, despite the paper's worn condition. But something about it made him uneasy. He'd heard rumors of the railroad's agents pushing smaller landholders out, especially around water sources. The morning wore on into afternoon. Susan insisted on helping with the laundry, though Robert could see how the work tired her. She hung sheets on the line while Mateo napped in a basket nearby, the breeze gently stirring the clean white fabric. Robert worked on replacing a broken fence rail, but he found his attention drawn repeatedly to the house. The sound of Susan humming to Mateo, the sight of fresh laundry on the line, it brought back memories that ached, but differently than before. As evening approached, Susan prepared a simple supper from what Robert had in his pantry. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking, and Robert realized how long it had been since these walls had held such homey scents. They ate together quietly, the lamp casting warm light across the table. Mateo sat in his mother's lap, and for the first time since Robert had found them in the grass, the baby smiled, a toothless, bright-eyed grin that caught Robert by surprise. Something shifted in his chest at that smile, like ice cracking on a spring creek. He found himself smiling back before he even realized it, the expression feeling strange but not unwelcome on his face. Susan caught his eye across the table, her own expression softening with understanding. Neither of them spoke, but the silence held a different quality than it had that morning, less awkward, more peaceful. The day settled into evening with a fragile sense of order, as if the house itself was adjusting to its new rhythm. Robert watched as Susan gently rocked Mateo, the baby's eyes growing heavy with sleep. His own heart, so long burdened with grief, felt lighter than it had in months, though the deed in his desk drawer weighed heavy on his mind. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Robert hitched his team to the wagon while Susan wrapped Mateo snugly in her shawl. The wooden wheels creaked as they set out on the rutted road toward town, the early sun warming their backs. "Town's about an hour away," Robert explained, keeping his eyes on the road. "Thought we might get you some proper supplies." He glanced sideways at Susan, who held Mateo close against the wagon's gentle swaying. "Whatever you need for the little one, too." The main street came into view as they crested a small rise. Dust rose from the wagon wheels as they pulled up. In front of Jensen's general store, the bell above the door tinkled as they entered, and the familiar sense of coffee, leather, and tobacco filled the air. Heads turned. Whispers rose. Robert could feel the stares as he guided Susan toward the dry goods. Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Barnes, fresh from their church society meeting, huddled near the fabric bolts, their disapproving glances sharp as needles. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Peterson muttered, just loud enough to carry. Robert Turner, of all people. Susan kept her eyes downcast, holding Mateo closer. The baby squirmed, making small fussy sounds that seemed too loud in the charged atmosphere. Robert squared his shoulders and began selecting supplies: beans, coffee, sugar, oats. He added extra of everything, ignoring the whispers that followed his movements. Mrs. Miller, a gentle-faced widow who played organ at church, approached Susan while Robert was measuring out coffee beans. Without a word, she pressed a small cloth pouch into Susan's hand. The unmistakable weight of flour made Susan's eyes water with gratitude. "God bless you, Signora," Susan whispered. Mrs. Miller just smiled and squeezed her arm before shuffling away. Robert paid for their purchases, his jaw set against the continuing murmurs. Outside, he loaded the supplies while Susan settled Mateo in the wagon. He needed to visit the blacksmith about a broken plow blade, but hesitated to leave them alone. "We'll be fine," Susan assured him, reading his concern. "Mateo needs feeding." Anyway, the blacksmith shop rang with the sound of hammer on anvil. Tom Wheeler worked the bellows, his face gleaming with sweat in the forge's glow. He nodded at Robert's approach. "Heard you got yourself some house guests, Turner," Wheeler sighed, dunking a glowing iron into water. Steam hissed up like an angry serpent. "News travels fast," Robert replied carefully. Wheeler wiped his hands on his leather apron. Might want to hear this then. Railroad men were in yesterday, talking big about water rights. That's spring out your evening. Way, he lowered his voice. They're fixing to claim everything around it. Say they need it for the steam engines. Robert's stomach tightened. They can't just take folks' land. Wouldn't be the first time they found a way. Wheeler's eyes were serious. Papers get lost. Deeds turn up invalid. Might want to watch yourself and your guests. The sun was settling toward the horizon by the time they started home. Susan sat quietly, Mateo sleeping against her chest. The wagon swayed gently, wheels crunching on gravel. I'm sorry about the store, Robert said finally. Folk here can be small-minded. Susan's voice held no bitterness, only tired understanding. It's the same everywhere, Senator Turner. But there are kind hearts too, like that dear woman with the flower. They rode in silence for a while, the evening air growing cooler. Finally, Susan spoke again, her voice soft but steady. You don't have to keep helping us. I know it makes trouble for you. Robert thought about Wheeler's warning, about the railroad's interest in the spring, about how empty his house had felt before their arrival. No trouble, he said firmly. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. The kitchen lamp cast warm shadows on the walls as they unloaded supplies that evening. Mateo lay sleeping in a makeshift cradle, a wooden box padded with clean straw and soft blankets. Susan moved quietly, putting away the provisions with careful hands. God must have sent you, she said suddenly, turning to face Robert. Her eyes shone in the lamplight. That evening in the grass, I was praying, holding Mateo, not knowing what else to do. Then I heard your horse. Robert felt something stir. In his chest, a tug of conviction, of purpose he hadn't felt since losing his wife. He thought of the railroad men, of the threats to Susan's land, of the baby sleeping peacefully in his kitchen. Maybe he did, Robert said softly, surprising himself with the words. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the darkening prairie. Inside, the lamp flickered steady and warm, holding the night at bay. 2 days after their trip to town, hoofbeats echoed across Robert's yard in the late afternoon. Thomas Turner rode up on his bay mare, dust coating his clothes from the journey. Robert recognized the set of his brother's jaw, the same stubborn look their father used to wear when troubled. Heard some interesting talk in town, Thomas said. Dismounting. His spurs jingled as his boots hit the ground. Thought I'd better ride over. Robert stood on the porch, watching his brother lead his horse to the water trough. Reckon you'd best come in for supper then. Susan's just putting it on the table. Inside, the kitchen was warm with the smell of beans and fresh cornbread. Susan had set 3 places, having heard the arrival of company. She moved quietly, keeping Mateo close in one arm while serving with the other. The baby watched the newcomer with wide, dark eyes. Thomas settled into a chair, his weathered face unreadable. They ate in silence for a while, broken only by the clink of spoons and Mateo's occasional soft noises. Finally, Thomas set down his cup with deliberate care. Brother, we need to talk plain, he said, his voice gruff with concern. You're fixing to get yourself in a heap of trouble. Robert continued eating, though his shoulders tensed. How's that? Railroad's been asking questions about that spring property. Thomas leaned forward, dropping his voice. And now you're harboring a squatter woman with a disputed claim? You're painting a target on your back. Susan's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Though she said nothing, her spine straightened, and her eyes flashed with quiet dignity. Mateo stirred against her chest, sensing the tension in the room. She has a legal deed, Robert said evenly. Thomas snorted. Legal don't mean much when the railroad wants something. You know that. They'll find a way to void it, mark my words. He turned to Susan, his expression stern but not unkind. Ma'am, I mean no disrespect, but you'd best move on before trouble starts. My brother's got enough challenges running this ranch without, that's enough. Robert's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Susan and her boy are my guests. Your guests could cost you everything." Thomas pushed back from the table. "Think about what you're risking. The railroad don't take kindly to folks standing in their way. They could make things mighty difficult for you. Your water rights, your grazing permits." Susan rose quietly, holding Mateo close. "I should put him to bed," she murmured, slipping from the kitchen. The baby's dark eyes peered over her shoulder as they disappeared down the hallway. The brothers sat in heavy silence. Outside, crickets had begun their evening chorus, a peaceful sound at odds with the tension indoors. "You always were stubborn," Thomas said finally, his voice softer. "Just like Pi, but he knew when to bend with the wind, too. Some things are worth standing firm for." Robert traced a pattern in the spilled salt on the tablecloth. "You remember what Ma used to say about helping strangers? Ma isn't here anymore, and times are different." Thomas stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Don't say I didn't warn you, brother." He paused at the door. "I'll pray you come to your senses before it's too late." The door closed behind him with a quiet click. Robert remained at the table, listening to his brother's horse move off into the gathering darkness. The crickets sang louder now, accompanied by the soft crackle of the hearth fire. His eyes fell on Susan's half-empty plate, on the small cup of milk she'd been sharing with Mateo. He thought about the worn deed in her possession, about her quiet dignity in the face of Thomas's words, about the trust in her eyes when she looked at him. Rising slowly, Robert walked to the front room where Susan sat by the fire, Mateo drowsing in her arms. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, reminiscent of that first night he'd found them in the grass. "Susan," he said quietly. She looked up, her face composed but her eyes uncertain. "I want you to know something." Robert's voice was firm, carrying the weight of decision. "As long as I draw breath, you and your boy have a safe place under this roof. No railroad man or anyone else is going to change that." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, catching the firelight. "Gracias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "God will bless your kindness, Senator Turner." Mateo stirred, making a happy gurgling sound as he reached toward the warm flames. A simple gesture seemed to fill the room with hope, pushing back the shadows of Thomas's warnings. Robert settled into the chair opposite them, watching the fire cast its gentle light over mother and child. Outside, the crickets sang their endless song to the stars, while inside, the hearth offered its steady warmth to those gathered in its glow. The wagon wheels creaked along the dusty road as Robert guided his team toward the white-painted church. On the hill, Susan sat beside him on the wagon seat, her dark shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. Little Mateo dozed in her arms, peaceful despite the jolting of the wooden wheels over rocks and ruts. Morning sunlight caught the church's simple cross as they approached, making it gleam like polished silver. Other wagons and riders converged on the building, families in their Sunday best making their way up the wooden steps. Robert helped Susan down from the wagon, steadying her elbow while she balanced Mateo. The whispers started as soon as they entered the sanctuary. Robert heard them clearly, soft murmurs rising like rustling leaves as heads turned to watch their progress down the aisle. Susan kept her eyes forward, chin lifted with quiet dignity, though her fingers tightened protectively around Mateo. "Did you hear the Turner place? That Mexican woman?" Robert guided them to a pew near the middle, where sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows. The wooden bench creaked as they settled in. A few rows ahead, Mrs. Peterson twisted around to stare openly before her husband nudged her to face forward. The circuit preacher rose from his chair beside the pulpit, his weathered face solemn as he opened his worn Bible. The morning light caught the silver at his temples as he began reading from Isaiah in his deep, steady voice. "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." The words seemed to hang in the air of the sanctuary. Robert felt them settle deep in his chest, stirring something that had lain dormant since his own wife's passing. He glanced at Susan, who was gently rocking Mateo, her eyes fixed on the preacher. "Thus says the Lord," the preacher continued, his voice growing stronger. "What do you mean by crushing my people? By grinding the face of the poor?" Robert's hands tightened on his knees. The whispers had died away, but he could feel the weight of stares still fixed on them. Mateo made a soft sound, and Susan hushed him tenderly. Something shifted in Robert's heart, a certainty as clear as morning light. Before he fully realized his intention, he was on his feet. "Reverend," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "If I might speak." The preacher paused, then nodded slowly. "Brother Turner?" Robert stood straight, his eyes sweeping across the familiar faces of his neighbors. Some looked away, but others met his gaze. "I want it known before God and this congregation," he said clearly, "that Susan Ortega and her son Mateo are under my protection. They have a legal claim to their land, and more importantly, they have a claim on Christian charity." His voice grew stronger. "Anyone who'd harm them or drive them away will answer to me, and to the Lord who commands us to defend the widow and the fatherless." The silence that followed was profound. Susan's eyes glistened with tears as she looked up at him. Then from the organ in the corner, the first notes of Blessed Assurance began to fill the air. One voice joined in, then another, until the familiar hymn swelled through the sanctuary. "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine, oh, what a foretaste of glory divine." Susan's whisper was barely audible above the singing. "God has heard my prayers." After the service, as people filed out into the sunshine, several of the women approached. Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, touched Susan's arm gently. "My Thomas was on that same railroad crew," she said softly. "If you need anything." She pressed a small package of cookies into Susan's hands. Others followed, Mrs. Anderson with a tender smile, young Sally Jenkins asking to hold Mateo, but Robert noticed others turning away, heading straight for their wagons with stiff backs and cold eyes. The ride home was quiet, filled with the steady clip-clop of hooves and the creak of leather harness. The morning sun had grown warm, and Mateo slept contentedly in Susan's lap. Robert glanced over to see a faint smile on her face, the first real peace he'd seen there since finding her in the grass. His own heart felt lighter too, as if speaking truth in the church had lifted a weight he hadn't known he carried. The grief that had haunted him since his wife's death seemed less sharp, softened by this new purpose that the wagon rolled on toward home, Sunday morning stretching bright and clear before them. In the distance, meadowlarks called from their fence posts, their songs carrying clear and sweet across the prairie grass dot. The summer days settled into a gentle pattern at the Turner Ranch. Each morning, Robert would find Susan already up, stoking the kitchen fire to life while Mateo played with a wooden spoon in his makeshift playpen, a corner of the kitchen fenced in with chairs and blankets. "Time you learn to milk," Robert said one dewy morning, leading Susan to the barn where their red and white cow waited. He positioned the bucket and demonstrated the rhythm: squeeze, pull, release. "Like this," he explained, streams of warm milk hitting the bucket's bottom with musical pings. Susan's first attempt sent milk spraying sideways, making her gasp and laugh softly. "I never thought I'd be a rancher's help," she admitted, but her determined fingers soon found the right touch. Within days, she could fill a bucket nearly as quick as Robert. The vegetable garden became her next lesson. Robert showed her how to thin the carrots and pick off tomato hornworms. "My wife Martha always said you had to talk nice to growing things," he said, then fell quiet, surprised at speaking Martha's name without the usual stab of grief. Susan nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My mother said the same of her chilies," she offered gently. She sang to them while she worked. While they tended the garden, Mateo would sit on a blanket in the shade, batting at grasshoppers and giggling at butterflies. His laugh, when it first burst forth one morning, startled them both, bright and bubbling like fresh spring water. Robert found himself smiling more often, the sound of the baby's joy filling empty corners of the house he hadn't realized were so silent. Inside, Susan's presence brought its own transformations. She darned socks that had lain neglected in Robert's drawer and patched shirts he'd been meaning to mend. The scent of fresh tortillas began mixing with his usual biscuits and bread, filling the kitchen with unfamiliar but welcome aromas. "These are mighty fine," Robert said one evening, using a tortilla to wipe his plate clean. "Reckon I could get used to such fare." Susan's eyes crinkled with pleasure. "They are simple food, but they remind me of home." Mateo was growing stronger, too, pushing himself up on sturdy arms and crawling across the wooden floorboards with determination. His favorite destination was Robert's boots by the door, which he would pat with tiny hands until Robert scooped him up, making the baby crow with delight. The peaceful rhythm of their days made it all the more jarring when Robert spotted the riders. He was replacing broken rails in the corral, hammer striking nails with practiced swings, when movement caught his eye. 3 men on horseback, dark shapes against the horizon, their bodies bent forward as they studied the ground near. The disputed spring. Robert's hand tightened on his hammer. Railroad men, without a doubt, scouting the water rights they coveted. He'd seen their kind before, men who measured land's worth in dollars, rather than lives sustained. He kept the sighting to himself through supper, not wanting to burden Susan with fresh worries. She had enough weight on her shoulders. But while she cleared the dishes, humming softly to Mateo, Robert's thoughts churned like storm clouds. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the kitchen walls as they settled in for the evening. Susan sat in the rocking chair, Mateo drowsy against her shoulder. Her voice, when she began to pray, was soft but clear. "Dear Lord," she whispered in English, though Robert had heard her sometimes pray in Spanish when she thought he couldn't. "Here, thank you for this roof, this food, this safety you have provided. Please protect the land Jose left for his son, land he died believing would give us a future." Her voice caught slightly. "And thank you, Lord, for sending us to Mr. Turner's door." Robert, sitting at the table with his Bible open before him, felt his troubled thoughts settle into firm resolve. The railroad men might come, but they would find more than a lone widow to deal with. His word given in church still stood. Susan and Mateo were under his protection, and that included their rightful land. The lamp flickered, making shadows dance. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the prairie, and somewhere in the barn, his horse nickered in response. Mateo's soft breathing joined the familiar night sounds as the baby drifted to sleep in his mother's arms. Susan's prayers continued, a quiet murmur of faith in the gathering dark, while Robert sat silent, his own prayers wordless but equally fervent. The land, the spring, the small family taking shape within his walls. He would defend them all, come what may. The morning sun beat down on Robert's ranch yard as he helped Susan hang laundry. Mateo played nearby in a patch of shade, stacking wooden blocks Robert had whittled for him. The peaceful scene shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 6 riders thundered into the yard, dust billowing behind them. Robert recognized the railroad agent's sharp-featured face beneath his black hat. 2 deputies flanked him, badges glinting, while 3 more men spread out behind. "That's far enough," Robert called, stepping forward. His hand stayed clear of his gun belt, but his stance was firm. The railroad agent dismounted smoothly, boots raising little puffs of dust. "Turner," he said, voice oily smooth, "we've come about the squatter woman you're harboring." Susan scooped up Mateo, holding him close. The baby sensed the tension, growing quiet against her shoulder. "Mrs. Ortega is my guest," Robert said evenly. "She has legal right to her land." The agent pulled a document from his vest. According to these papers, she's trespassing. The railroad has prior claim to that spring property. He thrust the paper toward Robert. She needs to clear out. Today. That's not possible, Robert replied, not touching the offered document. She has a valid deed. Susan's voice trembled but held steady. My husband paid for that land. He worked himself to death for the railroad to buy it. Show me this supposed deed, the agent demanded. Eyes narrowing. Susan shifted Mateo to one arm and withdrew the folded paper from her apron pocket. Before she could unfold it, the agent snatched it from her fingers. Hey now. Robert lunged forward, reaching for the deed. Everything happened at once. The deputies spurred their horses forward. One man's gun cleared leather. Robert's hand brushed the stolen deed before a deputy's rifle butt caught him in the shoulder, sending him stumbling. Robert! Susan cried out as he regained his footing. The agent tucked the deed into his vest pocket while the deputies surrounded Robert. You're under arrest, Turner, one deputy announced, for harboring a squatter and resisting law enforcement. This ain't law enforcement, Robert spat. It's theft. They seized his arms, twisting them behind his back. As they bound his wrists with rope, Robert locked eyes with Susan. Stay here, he called to her. Don't let them. A deputy's shove cut off his words. They dragged him toward a horse, forcing him to mount with bound hands. Susan stood frozen, Mateo beginning to wail in her arms. Clear out by sundown, the agent told her coldly. Or you'll face charges too. Robert twisted in the saddle. Susan! Stay hidden, I'll send word. The deputies spurred their horses, forcing Robert's mount into motion. Susan watched helplessly as they rode away, taking Robert and her deed toward town. Mateo's cries echoed across the suddenly empty yard as dust settled in their wake. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. Susan paced the house, jumping at every sound. She tried to keep busy, feeding Mateo, straightening Robert's room, folding the laundry they'd left half-hung. But fear gnawed at her like a living thing. As darkness fell, she lit the lamp with trembling hands. The familiar kitchen felt strange and exposed without Robert's steady presence. Every creak of the house timbers made her heart race. Even the wind seemed to carry menace, rattling the shutters like unwelcome hands testing the windows. Mateo fussed, picking up on her anxiety. Susan settled into the rocking chair by the hearth, cradling him close. The fire's warmth couldn't touch the cold dread in her heart. She had thought herself alone after Jose died, but this was different. Robert had become their protector, their anchor. Without him, the night pressed in like a physical weight. Me, Amor, she whispered, rocking slowly. Papa watches over us from heaven, and God will protect us now. But tears slid down her cheeks as she spoke the words. She remembered Robert's voice in church, strong and clear as he claimed them under his protection. He had given them shelter when they had nothing. Now he sat in a jail cell because of them, while men with false papers plotted to steal her land. The lamp flame wavered, making shadows dance on the walls. Susan drew her shawl tighter around Mateo's sleeping form. Sleep seemed impossible, but she had to stay strong. Robert had told her to hide, to wait for word. She would do that, no matter how the darkness tried to crush her spirit. Lord, she prayed softly in Spanish, her mother tongue feeling right for such a desperate prayer. Protect Robert as he protected us. Give us strength. Show us the way forward. The house creaked again in the wind. Susan kept rocking, kept praying as the long night settled in around them. The night stretched endless and dark around the ranch house. Susan moved from window to window, peering into blackness, while Mateo slept fitfully in her arms. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their wild voices making her shiver despite the warmth of the house. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. The empty chair by the hearth, where Robert usually sat, seemed to mock her helplessness. She had survived her husband's death, walked countless miles with a baby, only to face losing everything again. The lamp burned low as midnight passed, then the deep hours before dawn. Susan tried to rest in the rocking chair, but sleep refused to come. Mateo stirred and fussed against her shoulder. Sensing her unease as the first gray light crept through the windows, Susan straightened her shoulders. She could not sit here waiting for men to steal her land or worse. Robert had risked everything to protect them. Now she had to act. Moving quietly through the kitchen, she gathered what she could carry. Into a small cloth bundle went 3 fresh tortillas from yesterday's baking. She filled a tin cup with water and wrapped it carefully in her shawl. Mateo watched with wide eyes as she changed his cloth and tied him securely to her chest with a long strip of fabric, the way her mother had taught her. "We must be brave, mi amor," she whispered, kissing his dark curls. "God will guide our feet." The morning air felt cool as Susan stepped onto the porch. She had heard talk in town of the Ute Agency, where good people helped settle disputes about land. It lay miles to the north, past the spring that had caused all this trouble. Taking a deep breath, Susan started walking. The sun rose behind her, casting her shadow long across the dusty ground. Her shoes, worn thin from her previous journey, offered little protection from the rocky soil. But she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, whispering prayers in Spanish as she walked. The morning wore on, sun climbing higher. Sweat trickled down Susan's back, and her arms ached from holding Mateo. The baby grew restless in his cloth sling, wanting to move. But she dared not stop yet. The agency was still far ahead. By midday, the heat had become brutal. Susan's throat felt parched despite careful sips from the tin cup. Her legs trembled with each step. When she spotted a stand of cottonwoods beside a dry creek bed, she knew she had to rest. The tree's shade felt like heaven after hours under the burning sun. Susan sank down against a broad trunk, easing Mateo from his sling. He began to cry, hungry, hot, and tired of being carried. Pequego, she soothed, offering him what little water remained. She broke a tortilla into small pieces, feeding him carefully while her own stomach cramped with hunger. As Mateo nursed and dozed, Susan closed her eyes. "Lord," she prayed softly, "give me strength to reach help. Protect Robert in that jail. Show us your mercy." The sound of Mateo's steady breathing gave her courage. After a short rest, Susan tied him back in place, wincing as she stood on tired feet. The agency lay ahead. She could not falter now. The afternoon stretched endless. Before her, dust rose with each step, coating her skirts, her face, her hair. The sun beat down mercilessly. Several times she stumbled, catching herself before she fell. Mateo whimpered, but stayed blessedly quiet, as if he understood the importance of their journey. Susan fixed her eyes on the distant hills where she knew the agency lay. Robert had risked his freedom and safety for them. Her husband had died trying to secure this land. She would not give up while breath remained in her body. "Un paso más," she whispered. One more step, then another, and another. Dust rose behind her like a testament to her determination, marking the long path she walked. The sun moved slowly across the sky as Susan pressed onward, clinging to faith with each weary step toward help and hope. The sun hung low on the horizon when Susan finally glimpsed the weathered gates of the Ute Agency. Her legs trembled with each step, vision blurring from exhaustion. Mateo had fallen into an uneasy sleep against her chest, his small body hot from the day's journey. The agency building stood solid and square against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with lamplight. Susan stumbled the last few yards, her knees giving way just as she reached the front gate. The rough wooden posts felt cool against her forehead as she sagged against them. "Dear Lord." A clerk hurried down the steps, his boots crunching on gravel. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Susan tried to speak, but her parched throat produced only a whisper. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as Mateo stirred and began to cry. "Come inside quickly now." He guided her up the steps and through the door, calling out, "Henry, we need help here." The office interior felt blessedly cool after the burning heat outside. Susan sank into a offered chair, hands shaking as she loosened Mateo from his sling. An older native man appeared from a back room, his silver hair tied neatly back, his face etched with wisdom and concern. "I am Henry," he said, his voice gentle. "You have walked far today, I think." Susan nodded, tears threatening as the day's fear and exhaustion caught up with her. "Please, I need help. They took Robert Turner to jail, said I was trespassing, but I have a deed." "Robert Turner?" Henry's expression shifted with recognition. "I knew his wife, Sarah, a good woman with a kind heart." He pulled up a chair, sitting at eye level with Susan. "Tell me everything." The clerk brought water, and Susan sipped carefully between words as she explained. Robert finding her in the grass, the railroad men's threats, the stolen deed, the arrest. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bodice, withdrawing a folded paper she had hidden there, a copy of the deed she had kept separate from the one the railroad men had taken. Henry accepted the document with careful hands, unfolding it on his desk. His eyes moved deliberately across the Spanish text, weathered fingers tracing each line. "This deed," he said slowly, "it was your husband's?" "Yes," Susan whispered. "He worked for the railroad, died laying track. But he bought this land fair with 3 years' wages. The spring was his dream for our future." Henry nodded, beginning to translate aloud. His voice carried authority as he rendered the Spanish into clear English, explaining each section, the date of purchase, the precise boundaries, the water rights, the official seals. The clerk leaned in, taking careful notes. "This document is legitimate," Henry declared finally. "Every mark, every seal, it is proper and legal. The railroad's claim of trespassing is false." He looked at Susan with grave eyes. "They sought to steal your land through fraud, counting on no one being able to read the Spanish deed." Relief flooded through Susan, making her dizzy. Then Robert should never have been arrested," the clerk finished, straightening with purpose. "I'll ride into town with you tomorrow, testify to the deed's authenticity." Henry's translation carries weight with the court. Mateo began to fuss in earnest now, hungry after the long day. A native woman appeared with a pot of warm milk and clean cloths, helping Susan settle the baby. The clerk brought bread and soup, insisting Susan eat while he prepared a cot in a side room. "Rest tonight," Henry said, folding the deed carefully and returning it to her. "Tomorrow we will see justice done." He touched her shoulder lightly. "Your journey showed great courage. The land holds meaning beyond mere ownership. This I understand well. We will help you defend what is rightfully yours." In the small room, Susan lay on the narrow cot with Mateo nestled against her. The baby suckled contentedly at the bottle of warm milk, his eyes growing heavy. For the first time since watching Robert being led away in handcuffs, hope stirred in her heart. "God is good," she whispered, stroking Mateo's cheek. Outside the window, crickets sang in the gathering dark. The desert wind carried the scent of sage, and somewhere an owl called softly. Susan felt her own eyes growing heavy, the safety of the agency wrapping around her like a blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she could rest, knowing help had been found. Her deed was valid, her claim was true. And soon, God willing, Robert would be free. Robert shifted on the hard jail bunk, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. The cell's musty air hung thick around him, broken only by pale moonlight filtering through the barred window. His thoughts wandered to Susan and little Mateo, praying they had found safety in his absence. A deputy's boots scraped against the wooden floor as he passed. jangling his keys with deliberate slowness. "Ain't so high and mighty now, are you, Turner?" The man's voice dripped with contempt. "All this trouble over some Mexican squatter." Robert kept his eyes fixed on the patch of stars visible through his window, letting the deputy's words wash past him. In his mind, he heard the preacher's voice from that Sunday service, reading Isaiah's ancient words about defending the widow and orphan. The memory strengthened his resolve. "You're a fool, Turner," another deputy called from his desk. "Railroad's gonna take that spring one way or another. Might as well save yourself the trouble." In the neighboring cell, a drunk stirred from his stupor. "Railroad owns the judge," he slurred, rolling over on his cot. "Everybody knows it. Bought him same as they bought the mayor last year." He broke into a fit of coughing that echoed off the stone walls. Robert's stomach tightened at the drunk's words, but he refused to let despair take hold. Instead, he began to pray quietly, his mother's old hymns coming back to him in whispered verses. "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart." The night stretched endless, marked only by the deputy's rounds and the drunk's occasional mumblings. Robert's thoughts kept circling back to Susan, her quiet dignity, her gentle way with Mateo, how naturally she had fit into the rhythm of ranch life. The memory of finding them in the tall grass seemed both recent and distant, as if God had placed them in his path for a purpose. He was only beginning to understand. His ribs throbbed where the deputies had struck him during the arrest. The physical pain was nothing compared to the worry gnawing at his heart. Were Susan and Mateo safe? Had the railroad men returned to harass them? The not knowing was its own kind of torture. "Could make this all go away," one deputy suggested, pausing outside the cell. "Just sign a statement saying she was trespassing. Railroad might even make it worth your while." Robert met the man's gaze steadily. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The deputy spat on the floor. "Suit yourself. Enjoy that moral high ground while you can afford it." As the night deepened, Robert found himself wrestling with doubt. Had he done the right thing, taking in Susan and Mateo? The answer came immediately, yes. Whatever the cost, protecting them had been right. He thought of Thomas's warning, of the church gossips, of all who would have turned their backs. The easy path would have been to do nothing. To let Susan and her baby wander on, someone else's problem. But Robert knew he could never have lived with himself. His late wife Sarah would have taken them in without hesitation. He could almost hear her voice. "The Lord sets the lonely in families." Through the barred window, the stars began to fade as false dawn painted the sky in pale grays. Robert watched the light change, his body aching from the hard bunk, his spirit heavy with uncertainty. Was God watching? Had he abandoned them to the railroad's greed and the corrupt local law? The drunk in the next cell had finally fallen silent. Robert stood carefully, mindful of his injuries, and approached his window. The morning star hung bright above the horizon, reminding him of countless dawns on the ranch. Somewhere out there, Susan and Mateo were facing this same sunrise. He silently renewed his promise to protect them, whatever the cost. "Lord," he whispered, pressing his forehead against the cool iron bars, "I don't know if you can hear me, but please keep them safe. Show us a way through this valley." The sun's first rays struck the jailhouse wall, painting it gold. Robert straightened his shoulders, determined not to show weakness before his captors. He might be imprisoned, but his spirit remained unbroken. Whatever pressure the railroad and its men brought to bear, he would not betray Susan's trust. The morning light grew stronger, chasing shadows from the cell. Robert returned to his bunk, body weary but mind clear. He did not know what the day would bring, justice or further trials, but he knew with certainty that he had chosen the right path. Whether deliverance was coming or not, he would hold fast to his conviction. The deputy brought a tin cup of weak coffee, sliding it through the bars without a word. Robert accepted it silently, warming his hands against the metal. Outside, the town was beginning to stir, another day dawning in a world where power too often trampled justice. But Robert Turner sat straight-backed in his cell, clinging to faith, and praying for those in his care, ready to face whatever came next. The county courthouse buzzed with tension as townspeople packed the wooden benches. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Robert Turner stood straight back before the judge's bench, his wrists bound in iron shackles that clinked softly when he moved. Railroad men lounged near the front, their expensive suits and watch kinds marking them as different from the dusty ranchers and merchants who filled the rest of the room. The railroad agent smirked, leaning close to whisper something to his lawyer. Judge Harrison, a thin man with steel-rimmed spectacles, shuffled through papers on his desk. His gaze occasionally flicked toward the railroad men, betraying where his loyalties lay. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner," the judge began, his voice carrying clear through the stuffy air, "you stand accused of harboring an illegal squatter and resisting lawful authorities. These are serious charges that threaten the order of our community." Robert kept his expression neutral, though his heart pounded. He searched the crowd for any sign of Susan, praying she had found safety. The deputies had been rough during his arrest, and his ribs still ached with each breath. "The railroad company," Judge Harrison continued, "has presented clear documentation of their claim to the disputed spring and surrounding lands. Their right to evict trespassers is well established by—" The courtroom doors burst open with a heavy creak. Heads turned as Susan Ortega stepped through, holding Mateo close against her chest. The morning light caught the sheen of perspiration on her face, evidence of her long journey. Behind her stood Henry, the Ute elder, his dignified bearing drawing all eyes, and the agency clerk, clutching a leather portfolio. "Your Honor," Susan called out, her voice stronger than Robert had ever heard it, "I must speak before you pass judgment." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The railroad agent half rose from his seat, face darkening with anger. "This is irregular, Your Honor. The squatter woman has no standing here." Henry stepped forward, his presence commanding respect despite the railroad man's protest. "The court must hear this testimony," he said firmly. "A great wrong is about to be committed." Judge Harrison frowned, tapping his gavel once. "Young woman, this court is in session." "You cannot simply—" "I have proof," Susan interrupted, shifting Mateo to one arm while reaching into her shawl. She withdrew a folded document, now accompanied by fresh papers. "The deed to my land, properly translated and verified by the Ute agency." Robert's heart leaped. He watched as Henry and the clerk approached the bench, presenting the papers with careful formality. The railroad agent's face had gone pale. "Your Honor," the clerk explained, "I've certified this translation myself. The original Spanish deed is completely legal, registered with territorial authorities 3 years ago." Judge Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the documents. The courtroom held its breath as he studied them, his expression growing troubled. "Read it," Susan insisted, her voice carrying clearly. "Read it aloud, Your Honor, so all may hear the truth." The judge hesitated, glancing at the railroad men, but the weight of all eyes in the courtroom seemed to compel him. He cleared his throat and began to read, detailing the legal grant of land including the spring, properly witnessed and recorded. As the judge's voice faded, the crowd erupted in whispers. Robert saw several townspeople nodding, their faces showing a shift from suspicion to support. The railroad agent was now on his feet, sputtering protests. "The document they showed you earlier," Henry stated calmly, "was forged. This is the true deed, and the spring rightfully belongs to Mrs. Ortega." Judge Harrison removed his spectacles, wiping them slowly with a handkerchief. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new note of respect. "It appears there has been a serious misunderstanding. The court recognizes Mrs. Ortega's clear title to the land in question. Robert's eyes met Susan's across the courtroom. Her face shone with a mixture of triumph and relief, while Mateo burbled happily in her arms, unaware of the victory he had just witnessed. Robert felt overwhelmed with gratitude, amazed at the courage and determination that had brought her here at exactly the right moment. In light of this evidence, Judge Harrison continued, all charges against Mr. Turner are dismissed. Bailiff, remove those shackles. The iron cuffs fell away from Robert's wrists. He rubbed them absently, his attention still fixed on Susan. The railroad agent and his men were already slinking toward the door, their scheme exposed and defeated. The courtroom burst into movement and conversation. Several churchwomen who had once whispered criticism now hurried to Susan's side, offering congratulations and support. Henry stood quietly beside her, a small smile of satisfaction on his weathered face. The heavy courthouse doors swung wide. As Robert stepped into the afternoon sunlight, blinking against the brightness, a cheer went up from the gathered townsfolk, their voices rising like prairie birds taking wing. Women waved handkerchiefs while men clapped him on the shoulder, faces beaming with newfound respect. The Lord's justice prevails. Reverend Cole called out, making his way through the crowd. His weathered face creased with joy as he embraced Susan, careful not to disturb little Mateo sleeping against her shoulder. My dear child, your courage has shown us all what faith can do. The afternoon passed in a whirlwind of congratulations and apologies. Even those who had turned cold shoulders now stepped forward, shamefaced but sincere in their changed hearts. Robert noticed Mrs. Peterson, who had once whispered the sharpest criticism, pressing a cloth-wrapped loaf of fresh bread into Susan's hands. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Reverend Cole drew Robert and Susan aside. There's no better time than now, he said softly. Let's make this family proper before God and community. Susan's eyes widened, meeting Robert's gaze. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her smaller ones. If you'll have me, he said simply. Tears sparkled in her eyes as she nodded, and word spread quickly through the lingering crowd. Within hours, lanterns swayed from the branches of the old cottonwoods near Susan's spring. The water burbled softly beneath the gathering dusk, as if singing its own blessing. The townsfolk arranged themselves in a circle, holding lights that pushed back the growing darkness. Mrs. Peterson led the choir in amazing grace, the familiar notes floating across the evening air. Susan stood radiant in her simple dress, wildflowers woven into her dark hair by the same women who had once shunned her. Reverend Cole's voice carried clear and strong as he spoke of God's providence, of how love could bridge any divide. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he repeated his vows, his heart so full it felt near to bursting. When Susan spoke her promises, Mateo reached out from her arms to pat Robert's chest, bringing tender laughter from the gathered witnesses. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, Reverend Cole declared. Robert gathered Susan and Mateo into his embrace, lifting them both as joy overflowed. My family, he whispered, the words tasting sweet as honey on his tongue. Lantern light caught the tears on Susan's cheeks as she looked up at him, her smile bright as dawn. More hymns rose into the star-scattered sky, voices joining in harmony, while crickets added their evening chorus. The spring waters reflected the golden glow, as if the very land celebrated with them. Robert held his new wife and son close, feeling the hollow places in his heart filling at last. After years of grief and solitude, he had found not just love again, but a deeper purpose. In Susan's courage and Mateo's innocence, he recognized God's hand at work, weaving their separate sorrows into a tapestry of shared joy. Morning light spilled across the prairie as Robert and Susan walked hand in hand toward the spring, their footsteps leaving gentle tracks in the damp grass. Mateo bounced happily on Robert's strong arm, reaching for butterflies that danced in the warm breeze. The water sparkled like scattered diamonds where sunlight touched its surface. This precious spring, the very thing that had nearly torn them apart, now united them in purpose. Susan knelt at the water's edge, her skirts pooling around her as she guided Mateo's tiny hands to touch the cool stream. His delighted squeal echoed across the quiet land. "This water," Robert said softly, resting his hand on Susan's shoulder, "it ain't just ours to own. We're stewards of God's gift here." He watched Mateo splash, remembering how close they'd come to losing it all. "Any neighbor in need will find welcome at this spring." Susan nodded, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "We'll teach Mateo to share its blessing," she whispered, "just as you shared your home with us." Together they talked of dreams while the sun tracked westward, adding cattle to the herd, planting an orchard, building a room for the growing boy. Their voices mingled with the gentle gurgle of the spring, weaving plans for a future rich with promise. As purple evening shadows crept across the land, Robert gathered his wife and son into his arms. This time, there was no desperation in his embrace, only love and thanksgiving. He carried them toward their home, where lamplight already glowed in welcome, marking the end of their first full day as a family. If today's story echoed in your heart, I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe, and I'll be here again tomorrow with another story that speaks softly but stays deeply.